Republicans are contending that the House Intelligence Committee memo, which was released yesterday, reveals that there were partisan motives that led to the issuing of FISA warrants against Carter Page and are thus disqualifying to the entire Mueller probe. Now, at the moment, there's a lot of he said, she said going on, and because we don't have the Democratic memo and because we don't have the actual intelligence upon which the partisan claims are based, it's really difficult to gauge who's telling the truth. But what is interesting is this allegation that partisanship is automatically disqualifying. That partisanship automatically means that one is subjective, that one cannot be objective. And this, frankly, it's a modern assertion and one that's pretty fundamental and I would say pretty unchallenged. But the meaning of politics at its core really has nothing to do with partisanship. Politics is the arts or the style of governing. If you read the ancient Greek, art is a term that's thrown around, and it has to deal largely with structure and with functions and not necessarily about people. The idea that it's about people and personalities and agendas which have been subsumed into the actual act of governing is something that is much more modern, which is not to say that historically ancient nations didn't have political partisanships and agendas, because obviously they did. But this idea that we have in America that if one is a partisan, one can't be objective is really troubling if you think about it. And there are multiple instances where we can see how this is operating. Think of the case brought against Donald Trump, in which the judge was of Mexican origin, and Donald Trump claimed that because of this, the case couldn't be fairly adjudicated because of Trump's comments on the wall and on immigration. You have allegations that Justice Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court should have recused himself from the Obamacare ruling because his wife was an anti-Obamacare activist. You have allegations about Andrew McCabe's wife, who was running for political office, I believe in Virginia, and who received campaign donations from Democrats, and this was used to attempt to discredit McCabe. The same thing with multiple lawyers on the Mueller probe, who, because their donations were primarily Democratic, was used to try and claim that this proved that the that the investigation had Democratic leanings and therefore couldn't be truly objective. And this idea that if you have a partisan affiliation or a partisan identity, and this is automatically disqualifying of you being able to engage in an objective, rational process and make sound, judgmental decisions, is truly troubling for politics, in the sense that it is the act of governing and hopefully governing functionally. Because essentially what that means is everything that one does is bias, and every bias means that one's mind is closed. One's incapable of gauging facts, looking at them on their merits, and comparing them within context of a given situation. Now, clearly we know that human beings do this, and to some extent this is not problematic, because if you look at basic survival, law of nature type of stuff, you do want to have bias because you want to be able to sense things that are dangerous versus things that are beneficial. And when you make a judgment in favor of something that you think is going to benefit you, is going to help preserve your life or improve your life, that's a bias towards one's own self-preservation. So in some degrees, bias is a good thing. However, that kind of bias is based on rational analysis and even an objective look at oneself and the situation that one hopes to find oneself in, or one hopes to one day find oneself in, to improve it. Okay, this is when we talk about our philosophy of discretionism on the website. This is what we mean, that kind of discretion based in objective analysis of the facts available to oneself and being able to look at them in context and even being able to look at oneself objectively. This involves a process of discretion that should not be looked down upon or turned into a pejorative, but ought to underlie everything that one does, because this helps to create this cohesive sense of self, which makes self-achievement more possible on a higher level. But that's slightly beside the point in this case. But so what we can determine from this is that there are instances in which bias are good, and there are instances in which bias is based off of a selection for truth. Because really, if you think about it, truth is not objective. It is a reflection of something that is demonstrably true, something that is. And that's a bias in favor of whatever that entity is. And if human perceptions and human biases reflect this, then we shouldn't name this a bad thing. And the act of governance, since governance is a choice, should be able to reflect this. But this, obviously, when we talk about politics as a pejorative, is not what we're talking about. In that case, we're talking about partisanship. Politics and partisanship have become synonymous. So anytime someone talks about political motives, they're talking about their partisan leanings and how these become translated into an agenda and how that moves government towards one set of goals or another. And again, within a certain framework, this isn't that problematic. If one is an ideologue, if one has a rigid set of principles which one believes is in the interest of the country, then ideally one hopes that that is the basis of one's political behavior, that one is trying to move government towards the set of ideals that you believe is most true. That is a positive overall if we're looking at politics in the framework of benefiting the nation state as a whole. Now, that view becomes a little problematic if we're going to look at the possibility of individualism and self-governance, but that's an issue for another day. But returning to this idea that the partisan is the political and that personal agendas become automatically conflated with politics, that is more deeply problematic because, and as we can see from a lot of the narratives swirling around the Trump administration and attempts to discredit either Donald Trump or to discredit the Mueller probe or to discredit different parts of Congress, there's this basic underlying assumption that anytime anyone expresses an opinion or not even an allegiance to a particular party, but expresses that they think that that's the right way, that is automatically disqualifying of their judgment, not just in regards to that particular subject, but completely and totally over all areas of life. So anytime anyone expresses a bias, that automatically means that they cannot be an objective human being. It totally shuts that down. And that, if you want to have a functional politics, is deeply problematic because it promotes a view of humanity in which really people are nothing but a sum of different identities. And because the assumption is that that identity means that one cannot have an objective rational process, it also means that whatever that identity is that disqualifies you from being objective to begin with isn't rooted in objective judgment anyway. So really, this creates a politics in which objectivity and any sort of choice are not, they are incongruous. And again, that is really problematic if you want to have any sort of limited government.